Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over this series and last, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the struggle for human rights. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we're discussing the situation of refugees in the world. My guest is Gonzalo Vargas Llosa, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Representative to the United Kingdom. He took up his post in October 2014. Before that, he spent 4 years at the UNHCR's representative to the Dominican Republic, and he has served in New York, Panama, and Geneva, as well as on special emergency missions to Pakistan, Darfur, Sudan, and Libya. So welcome, Gonzalo. It's great to have you here on this episode of the Rights Track.
Thank you very much, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's a really interesting time that we live in the world today, and there's a lot of press coverage about refugees. We've had the refugee issue on European shores for a number of years now, with mixed reviews, mixed statements, lots of public press and commentary, and of course the issue in the United States, the election of Donald Trump and the flow of refugees to the United States, and all of the issues that surround this people on the move, as we often refer to refugees. But I wonder if we could just get a sense of the full nature and extent of the issue. And my first question for you, Gonzalo, really is about what are the main drivers for refugee flows? What is it that makes people become a refugee in that sense?
Yes, well, as you know, refugees are either persons who are fleeing persecution, individual persecution in their countries of origin, or fleeing generalized violence or war or conflict. We've just published a few weeks ago our report, our statistics on the situation in 2016, and really the picture, as you know, it's frightening. The number of people forcibly uprooted, I should say, has now reached 65.6 million people last year, more than 22 million of them refugees, so people who've actually had to cross a border to seek safety, and another 40 million who've been uprooted, but who have chosen or selected to stay within their country. So the figure is, it's staggering. There are now 20 people who are newly displaced every minute of the day, or 28,300 every day. It's an extraordinary figure, and it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the problem. Also worth highlighting, as you mentioned, the reasons or the causes for this increase in human forced displacement. Just to give you another statistic, 55% of all refugees today come just from 3 countries, from Syria, from Afghanistan, and from South Sudan. So there you have 3 situations of conflict or of severe insecurity that account for a significant percentage of the refugee flows.
Yes, and that overall magnitude is high, but is it the highest it's been since World War II? Is that the sort of number that we're looking at today?
Yes, it has. It's been the highest. Said in the past 3 or 4 years, one of the countries that has produced the largest number is Syria, which is now a conflict that has been going on for more than 5 years. Syria alone has more than 5 million refugees. But at the moment, in fact, the situation that is creating refugees at the highest speed, if you like, is actually in South Sudan. So I mentioned this also not because, particularly in the past couple of years, the world's attention seems to be on the refugees arriving in Europe, arriving either in Italy or arriving in Greece. There is a kind of a media frenzy about Europe being flooded by refugees. And I think that it's important in that debate or in that scenario to keep in mind that, almost 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, live in developing countries. They are not in Europe. They are in countries like Turkey, that is today the country that hosts the largest number of refugees, 2.99 million. They are in places like Pakistan, which hosts 1.4 million Afghans, in Lebanon, where they have 1 million Syrian refugees, and where I think 25% of the population are now refugees in places like Iran, where they have almost 1 million refugees, Uganda, another 1 million refugees. So I think it's important to remind people listening to your podcast that, yes, of course, Europe has seen a significant surge of arrivals over the past couple of years, but it's important to keep that in perspective and to remind ourselves that still the large majority of refugees are choosing to stay in their regions of origin.
And so that puts increasing pressure on infrastructure that's already under pressure. These are lesser developed countries. They have their own constraints, their own limits on resource. So the arrival of the refugees puts an additional pressure on them. And as I understand it, refugees are held in special places, special camps, as it were, which have certain jurisdiction and certain protections, etc. Could you talk us through a little bit around the legal protections for refugees? Because there are people who are displaced forcibly. There are those that are fleeing persecution. There are those who perhaps take advantage of the economic opportunities, and that's also generates some negative press. You know, when we see refugees arriving in Europe, some of the popular press here say, they're economic migrants, they're just looking for economic opportunity, or there are terrorist infiltrators who are, being sent here by ISIS to infiltrate our towns and cities. So, what are the legal protections for the people on the move? What can the international community do in terms of protecting them? And how much effort is there around returning people to their homes, trying to protect them from persecution were they to be returned to their home countries?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you raised 2 or 3 points there. Maybe let me try to address them. One of them, you talked about at the beginning about the question about the burden that refugees place on particularly on countries that don't have many resources, countries in developing countries. And yes, this is an absolutely critical issue. I think that one of the drivers, for example, that made many Syrians who were living in Jordan, in Lebanon, or in Turkey, one of the main drivers, not the only driver, but one of the main drivers that made many of those Syrians move from those countries of asylum in the region to Europe was because the level of funding for assistance to Syrian refugees in that region dropped quite significantly. And in fact, in some instances, the World Food Program had to cut food rations by almost by half. So it's extremely important that when we think about refugees, about how to address particularly the secondary movements of refugees to places like Europe, that the emphasis must be on strengthening the level of assistance, the level of aid that is given to those developing countries so that it can meet the minimum requirements, the minimum basic needs of refugees. But in addition to the minimum needs, and by that I mean, food, water, and health, also to provide those refugees with economic opportunities, with livelihood opportunities, especially because in many instances those refugees have to stay in those developing countries for many years, and if they don't see economic opportunities, then they are likely to want to move from where they are, whether it's Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey or elsewhere in the world. Then they're likely to try to move to places like Europe. Now, in terms of the other point you raised, yes, I mean there are in these movements, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa through Libya and across the Mediterranean into Italy and into Greece, you have a mixture of people, of course. You have people who are fleeing a conflict, you have people who are fleeing war and persecution, but you also have people who are fleeing just poverty. But there are people who think that the majority are people who are just fleeing poverty, and that's not the case. I mean, you have Syrians, you have Afghans, etc. People who are fleeing, war and conflict. And yes, of course, it's important to make a differentiation. I mean, everybody deserves a humane treatment, but refugees have certain legal rights, and economic migrants have a different set of rights, and the rights of refugees are enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Convention there very clearly. And what is absolutely critical is that governments, including, of course, in Europe, live up to the commitments they have made as signatories to the 1951 convention, because that's not an act of compassion. That's a legal obligation. And you talked about, you stressed the word legal. On that, maybe I should say on a related point, particularly in the past couple of years, and including in Europe, there have been a number of voices saying that the 1951 Refugee Convention has become irrelevant in today's world, and that what we need to do is revisit the convention, or others have gone as far as saying that we need to do away with the convention altogether. And our position is very clear, because the 1951 convention has, over the past decades, has saved millions of lives. It continues to save millions of lives. And the problem is not the convention. The problem is that many states do not abide by the commitments they have made in signing that convention. And you have seen in Europe, unfortunately, in the past couple of years, many governments showing enormous compassion and solidarity, but also respect for those commitments that they have made by signing the convention. But you have seen other governments that I won't name today, but I think we all know which are those, that in fact have put up barriers and have put up fences to refugees coming into Europe.
Yes, and I think at the peak of the early peak in the European crisis, Angela Merkel said, "All refugees welcome," which on the face of it looked like a very positive step, a very humane gesture. But others have criticized her and said that this created a kind of a new pressure, a new pull factor for refugees to come to Europe, because they thought, well, Germany's open, so we can all go to Germany. Is there evidence of that, or is it much more complicated than these popular accounts suggest?
I think that the problem was not the Chancellor's gesture. I think it was it showed an extraordinary leadership at a very complex moment. I think that there are, a couple of problems there. I think the problem was not her gesture or her magnanimous decision. I think that it was, one of the problems was that she didn't end up having many followers among the other European leaders. I think that if there's something that we have seen in the past couple of years in Europe as a result of this, relatively large refugee arrivals, is a lack of solidarity between governments, between states in Europe, with some governments taking the approach that the German Chancellor took, but other leaders in Europe taking an absolutely different approach. There were also promises, as you know, among many others, between the European EU countries, that they would, relocate. I believe it's 160,000 refugees or asylum seekers, and I think that to date, I think it's about 30,000 of them only have been relocated. So I think that this absence of solidarity among, Europe is a very big place. And the 1 million arrivals, yes, I'm not suggesting it's an insignificant number, but if there had been a lot more solidarity between EU states and governments, well, Germany would not have ended up with such a large proportion of them. So I think this is one key piece that has been missing, and I think is still missing today. And I think that, linked to that, these calls, including very recently, that everything must be done by stopping the ships or the boats or the dinghies that people use to get from places such as, particularly from Libya, to Italy and Greece. Of course, we're also extremely concerned by the fact that people opt for taking these very dangerous journeys, and more than 2,000 people have died already this year doing this very dangerous crossing. But the solution is not stopping it's just stopping the boats. As long as you don't give an alternative to people persecution, I mean, they will still make their way here. The way to address that is, and we talked about that earlier in the interview, is to try to address the root causes, whether that's violence, conflict, but also by significantly increasing the amount of aid that is given to refugees in their regions of origin, so that they feel that they have a choice to stay.
Yes. And what currently is the sort of expectation for the United Kingdom? Because it's still a member of the European Union, it still has a number of obligations, certainly is a signatory to the 1951 Convention. What sort of pressures on the UK to take larger numbers or a number currently? I
mean, I think that the UK, I would say, make 2 or 3 points. The first one being that, I think the UK is one of the most important donors in terms of humanitarian aid for refugees in their regions of origin. I'm thinking particularly of the very substantive funding that they make available to help Syrian refugees in places like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey, and similarly with other refugees in other parts of the world. So I think that as a donor of humanitarian aid, the UK is among the top countries in the world. I am also pleased that in the past 2 years, specifically, the UK has stepped up quite significantly the number of refugees that it resettles from countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey. As you know, they have committed to relocate or resettling 20,000 Syrians until 2020. In addition to that, they have committed to resettling 3,000 children at risk from the Middle East and North Africa region. This, compared to the case 3 or 4 years ago, represents a major increase. So I think this is also positive.
So I just wanted to wrap up a bit here in the sense that you've talked about the magnitude of refugees is almost unprecedented from looking back towards World War II and the post-war period. You've talked about the main drivers, principally conflict, and the main proportion of refugees coming from Afghanistan, from Syria, from South Sudan. It was that South Sudanese element that's often missing from the popular accounts of refugee flows.
Absolutely.
And then you also said a lot about responses, that there is an immediate response, there are immediate opportunities and incentives for refugees to make the choices that they are making, but really the solution is one of conflict resolution, to bring an end to conflicts in Afghanistan, Syria, and South Sudan as quickly as possible, to eliminate the push factor of people moving out, but equally to continue to extend humanitarian assistance and aid to provide the opportunities and cushion for the people who have been displaced internally and have decided to cross a border, but that don't necessarily need to take the full leap onto the very dangerous journey to Europe, etc. So, you've talked about solutions, and a lot of that hasn't been about laws and boundaries and walls and the sort of negativities that we see in the coverage of the refugee problem. But I think you've also highlighted the very, very complex nature of the problem alongside the magnitude, that this is a very, very large number of people affected, and that any solution that is forthcoming is going to take many, many years indeed. So I guess with that, I just wanted to thank you for your time today. It's been very enlightening talking to you, Gonzalo, and I wish you the very best for all the very hard work that you're doing on behalf of the UNHCR. Thank you. Thank you for being on this episode of The Rights Track.
Likewise, Todd. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 2 of the podcast is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. More information, including all the podcast episodes from Series 1 and accompanying show notes for each of our interviews, is available on our website at www.rightstrack.org.